The Venus of Urbino was the type of painting that became especially popular in sophisticated court circles, where male patrons could enjoy and appreciate the images of nude women under the cloak of respectable classical mythology. You may notice that the Venus of Urbino is looking back at the viewer, but she does so in a not straightforward way. Instead, she looks coyly at the male spectator, with deliberately provocative gestures, stretching languidly on her couch in a spacious palace, her glowing flesh and golden hair set off by white sheets and pillows. Her hand gesture is ambiguous. She is covering her private parts, but also maybe caressing herself in an inviting way. Over 300 years later, Manet painted Olympia, inspired by the Venus of Urbino. Olympia represents a modern Paris prostitute. Not a goddess, but an earthly woman with a name and an assumed agency and independence since she has her own source of income. The two women are examples of the art historical reclining nude, but they are each behaving very differently. An interesting detail that highlights this difference in behavior are the animals beside the two women. Laying by the feet of the Venus of Urbino is a dog, an agreeable and gullible animal, which sleeps peacefully, whereas by the feet of Olympia is a cat, arching up its back in a gesture of hostility. The distinct behaviors of the two animals double down on the respective behaviors of the women portrayed alongside them. One is agreeable, available, and inviting, whereas the other is trying to keep a distance and a position of power over the viewer by looking back at him sternly and straightforwardly. Moreover, instead of looking up at us, Olympia gazes down at us, indicating that she is in the position of power. This shift in the representation of the reclining nude reflects the socioeconomic changes European society went through with the Industrial Revolution. The roles of women in society began to adapt to new ways of living that included the appearance of a new working class and an urban environment. It is precisely that kind of thing that has inspired me to think about whether the many women on the covers of the Kamelot albums also changed throughout the years in accordance with the evolving conversation about gender roles in society. Kamelot, the revered Tampa-based symphonic, progressive, power metal band known for their melancholic, elegant, and beautiful sound. The band was founded in 1991 by guitarist Thomas Youngblood and ex-drummer Richard Warner. But it was the release of the band's fourth album, The Fourth Legacy, which marked a shift in the music production of the band with the addition of producers Myro and Sasha Peth, who remained working with the band for the remainder of its career. Myro and Sasha have backed the period that Kamelot defined its sound and reached higher levels of proficiency and visibility. Because of that, The Fourth Legacy is a decisive turning point in the band's catalog. But The Fourth Legacy is also the first of Kamelot's albums to feature a constant visual element ever since, the female figure as the focal point of their album covers. The album cover of The Fourth Legacy was created by Derek Gorse and shows a woman surrounded by a luminous purple hue, standing nude and turned away from the viewer, partially covered by a very sheer white veil. Because most of the songs in the album refer to Arthurian literature, there is reason to believe the woman on the cover is a representation of the Lady of the Lake, who has different names depending on the iteration of the legend. Among the reasons to believe it could be her are the sword she holds, Excalibur, and the white veil she wears. Those are attributes, or objects held or worn by persons that allow for their identification, like a crown indicates a given figure is a queen or a king. To analyze the presence of this woman on this album cover, a couple of elements are key: her nudity and her pose. The female nude is a trope of the visual arts that dates back to one of the first man-made objects ever found, the Venus of Willendorf. The figurine, found near the city of Willendorf in Austria, is believed to be from 24 to 22,000 BCE and is considered by some one of the first works of art ever. She was named after the many Venuses that appear in art history. These nude women portrayed in works of art were given the name Venus after the Roman goddess of love. The works of art and the philosophy of ancient Greece and Rome were regarded in European culture as ideal and were often taken up as the guidelines for artists throughout the history of European art. The image of the mythological Venus is an example of what philosophers called allegories, which are symbolic illustrations of a concept or a principle. Calling a woman a Venus also has another useful effect. It abstracts her. Instead of giving that woman the name of the model that posed for the painter, for instance, he, and yes, most of the time it was he, strips away the individuality of the woman in a way that makes her represent womanhood instead. It also drives the attention away from the fact that the painter and the nude model were physically around each other while the woman was naked, which could be frowned upon. For all effects, the scene depicted in the painting did not take place among mortals or between painter and indecent naked woman. Instead, it's a depiction of an allegory who is always above the modesty of mankind because she is the goddess of love. There are many male nudes in the history of art, but the female nude has characteristics of its own. Take the example of the Aphrodite of Knidos and Michelangelo's sculpture of David. Do you notice a very subtle difference? The Aphrodite is covering her pudenda, a term used to refer to the female genitalia, or her shameful parts. The tradition then carried on with the hiding of the pudenda. Female nudes in art history have a concern with modesty when it comes to the female body, that it does not with the male body. Simultaneously, the hand close to the pudenda also has the effect of bringing attention to the area, suggesting the woman's sexuality instead of hiding it. So the covering of a Venus private part is usually ambiguous, to say the least. But nudity alone does not account for the whole tradition of the female nude. Just as important as the nudity is the pose. Besides the covering of the pudenda, there is the allowance for the male gaze to reign supreme in the viewing of the woman. What does that mean? It means that the woman would predominantly not look back at the male individual staring at her vulnerable figure. If she did, she would do so in a markedly submissive or inviting manner. This way, the man looking at her is free from judgment, questioning, and shame. He is free to see, think, and feel anything as a result of looking at the undressed woman. Were the woman to stare directly back at the male gazer, she would subtly tell him that she sees what he's doing, and may also be thinking or feeling something about the fact that he is looking at her nudity. The looking away of the female figure ensures the comfort of the man, the freedom of the male gaze. On the cover of the Fourth Legacy, despite the nudity, the woman has her back to the observer. Her butt is right there, and her curves are exposed for the viewing. You may be wondering, Mariana, Kamelot has female fans who also would be looking at this picture. Then I would have to remind you that, historically, the metal fan base has been predominantly male, as well as the bands themselves. Especially in 1999, when the album was released. How many metal bands do you know that are entirely formed by women? What about men? The bottom line is, the representation of the female figure on the cover of the Fourth Legacy seems to be in alignment, to some degree, with the pre-modern tradition of the female nudes of the Venuses in respect to the male gaze and the female modesty. What came after that? This. The woman on the cover of Karma is most likely a representation of Elizabeth Bathory, the Hungarian countess who imprisoned, tortured, and brutally assassinated dozens, possibly hundreds, of young women for sadistic pleasure. Rumors said she bathed in the blood of virgins to remain young, which seems to be depicted on the cover of Karma, and is the theme of the trilogy Elizabeth, which caps off the album. How different is the cover of Karma from the cover of the Fourth Legacy? Well, somewhat different, but not that much. One of the differences is that the woman is now clothed, regardless of how revealing her outfit is. It's also different in pose. She is not turned back from the viewer. However, she is still looking away as a gazed upon object, not a gazing subject. This woman is closer to you, and despite looking away, she has a face that can be seen, and as a result, more individuality than the previous woman, who was reduced to a body without a face. These slight changes may be slight, but they do create a different relationship between the viewer and the female figure. This relationship becomes a tad more intimate, which makes the safety of the viewer slightly more at risk, with the possibility of the woman gazing back at him at a simple turning of the eyes. The proximity between woman and observer makes her less a mere part of an environment, as in the Fourth Legacy, and more an individual shown with considerably more prominence, detail, and uniqueness. Throughout the history of art, artists made conscious decisions like these, to include or not the face of a person in an image, to create an impression on the viewer. To show a face or to not show a face has historically been more than a random step in art making. It has been deliberated with particular intentions for particular results. That's why it's important to notice that 1. On the cover of Karma, the decision has been made to show the face of the woman, and 2. To think about what the cover would look and feel like to us viewers if this woman's face were not visible to us. From Karma to Epica, we see the addition of another female figure. Here they use 2 women at the same time, and each of them is a character in the story that the album tells. Epica is the first half of a conceptual 2-album release, Epica from 2003 and The Black Halo from 2005, which we will get to shortly. The narrative is based on Goethe's Faust, the world literature classic. The 2 women shown are Helena and Mephisto. Helena is the love pair of Ariel, the protagonist of the story. Mephisto is the devil, who comes into the story incarnated in the body of a beautiful woman, and tricks Ariel into all sorts of pleasures of the flesh. The cover of Epica could be understood to also represent womanhood, but this time split in 2. On the left side, there is Helena, associated with light colors, white dress and blonde hair, releasing white doves in the air. On the right side, but left side of Ariel, who stands in the middle, is Mephisto, with dark hair, a voluptuous body that is accentuated by a revealing, body contouring outfit in purple. I believe most of us are familiar with an old burden of femininity, the virgin/slut dichotomy. It's that conception of womanhood based on which women can never win. To be sexually desired, she needs to appeal to the lust of men, with a certain availability. But to be respected, she needs to give herself respect by acting virgin-like, with modesty and discretion. Those 2 demands are represented here, each in the figure of a separate woman, Helena and Mephisto. It is important to notice that this is the only Kamelot album cover to depict a male figure. The context of the narrative makes this odd inclusion an understandable choice, but the presence of not 1, but 2 women works in such a way as to almost compensate for that male presence. However, Ariel is not only in the center of the image, he is bigger than the 2 women, and his open arms and wings cover a good chunk of the space of the image. Here, the 2 women outnumber the man, but are still accessories to the narrative of a male protagonist, depicted in between them. Here's the thing. Their bodies are positioned facing us, and their faces are visible. And they are close enough to have details and individual features. But they are still not looking at us, the viewers, whether coyly or not. Enter the Black Halo, when a whole lot changes. Maybe by looking at this image right now, before I even say anything about it, you are already able to pick up on a few cues it gives us based on our discussion so far. But we will get deeper into it in part 2. So what have we been able to identify so far in these images? We have seen a female figure turn from a faceless nude body seen from behind at a safe distance to 3 females with visible faces, clothed, seen from the front at a closer distance with more detail and individuality. That means that the nudity and the pose have changed over time. But the gaze remains. They do not gaze back at the viewer. All of them also show either their entire bodies or a significant portion of them. The face comes in the picture, but the body still remains in it, more often than not exposed or highlighted. We could also be talking about the other formal elements that constitute images, such as color and line. But because our focus for this series is the female figure, I will keep my attention on the formal elements that appear in conjunction with the figures the most. In the next video, we will see why the Black Halo represents a big visual departure from the covers we have seen thus far. despite being by the same artist and same band, and a continuation of a story established in a previous release. Stay tuned for the sequel, and stay metal.